welcome back to another wonderful episode of Whining About Herstory, the women's history podcast where two longtime gal pals drink a bunch of wine and whine about women from history that you probably haven't heard of, but definitely should have. Today we have a very special episode. We have a guest with us, so we'll start with that. So I'm Kelly.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Eden Collinsworth.
So yes, today we are talking with the author, Eden Collinsworth, about her new book that just released, The Improbable Victoria Woodhull, Suffrage, Free Love, and the First Woman to Run for President. Me and Emily both had the chance to be able to read it. It is a wonderful book, but let's start at the beginning. And Eden, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself in general?
Oh God. Well, I don't know whether I can somehow reduce this to a couple of sentences. I sound as though I've got an attention deficit if I explain myself, but I promise you I'm fairly functional. So I seem to have done things in 10-year tranches during the course of a very peripatetic career that I don't think can happen these days. But I got out of university very determined to be an artist. I moved to New York, determined to be an artist. I had no money. That was at a time when, in fact, you could move to New York and not have money. But, I couldn't type, which was what really was required to be an assistant someplace. I needed to earn a living. And so I registered with what is supremely ironic, or what maybe it still exists, something called career blazers. And as though you're blazing ahead in a career, but I couldn't get off the ground because I couldn't type.
Okay.
And so the only job, and they're temporary jobs, so the only job that they could think of offering up was 2 weeks at Doubleday and Company on the executive floor as a receptionist where you do not type. And in a way, I promise you this is not false modesty, in a way that I can't even explain. About 8 years later, I was running a small publishing company called Arbor House, which was quite lively. We published Elmore Leonard and Anthony Burgess, and it was kind of a gas actually. And I did that for 10 years, and then I left I left New York to move to Los Angeles, where I'd never lived. I didn't know anything about magazine publishing, and I certainly had never raised money, but I decided that there was an opportunity to launch a magazine in Los Angeles, and take advantage of the kind of wonderful writers who are, who write either screenplays or books, or I had the opportunity and the advantage of bringing with me my Rolodex. So I knew a lot of wonderful writers, and I fundamentally gave them free rein. And so it was a very kind of interesting, eclectic editorial, and a monthly. So I did that for 10 years, and then I sold it to Fairchild. And at that point, I thought, because I've been behind a desk since I was 19, and I thought I'd give myself a break and move to Paris. But I was offered a job 2 months after, moving to Paris by the Hearst Corporation. And Hearst had bought the publishing house I was running. And so they offered me rather unexpectedly, a corporate position as the director of cross-media development, and I did that for 10 years. And then, in a kind of Ripley's Believe It or Not way, I was poached to become the chief of staff of a global think tank. I knew nothing.
Oh, wow.
This was not my background, but I was known as a good manager. And so the offices, it was all about what they call a track two diplomacy on various levels. It was cybersecurity and weapons of mass destruction and so on. I mean, very, very serious initiatives. And I did that for about 6 years. And I was stationed in 10 days a month in New York, 10 days in Brussels. Then I would travel 10 days, and it was Moscow, London.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was really, nobody knew where I was. At any rate, the point in all of this is that when I was at Hearst, I very quietly wrote a novel. I was really under the radar screen doing it because I was already thought of. I was the only woman really on the executive floor. and I was always thought of kind of as bohemian.
Okay.
But I felt confident I could write as a result of that, that one kind of first book. And so I moved to China, and this sounds really wacky, but it worked. I moved to China and wrote a book for Chinese, in Chinese. I had help on Western business practices. And I was there for 2 years because the book was censored, and I kind of was stuck in China. And then
Oh, wow.
finally it was released. And when it was, I moved to London, where I've been for the last 10 years. And I there I wrote three more books, the most recent of which is what
Yeah.
you've got in your hand or you've read. I
Yeah.
can't see it's in your hand, but
No,
at any rate.
I meant to grab it before we came down here,
No,
and it's
no, no, there's no
upstairs,
reason.
but
I'm
I
just, it's just
have
an
the
expression.
physical.
But I mean, you can see that it sounds fairly deranged, but I'm fairly reliable.
No,
I'm
my
not deranged, but it does sound as though I was, it's an unusual
yeah.
career.
Yeah,
Well, from that story, it makes me want to be like, okay, you've been in London 10 years. Are you going to be moving on again soon? Because it's
I
been
am
10
moving to
years. Are
Paris.
you
I am moving to
really?
Paris at the end of the
Oh my
year.
gosh.
Yeah,
That's
I've got
crazy that
well, I'm
it is like a
hoping to have a,
10-year cycle here.
oh,
yeah, I know. I think this is probably my last move. I'm tired of packing.
Yeah. That's that like the woman we're about to discuss. A lot of people say a lot of things, but it's like you've also lived this like really crazy like career trajectory, especially like publishing and stuff like that, and then to go to
Mhm.
this like think tank on like really intense discussions that had nothing to
Yeah.
do with your previous work, and then
No, and not
travel
only
all
that,
over.
it was almost exclusively. I've always been operating not deliberately, but circumstantially. You know, I, almost always has been the case that I'm, surrounded predominantly by men. But with the think tank, it was almost exclusively male, and that was very interesting because, frankly, at the risk of sounding making a sweeping generalization, there is something about a maleness that crosses cultural divide.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of got what I was, it was a challenge at times, but at any rate, it was quite interesting.
I
Yeah.
I also just want to point out that you started this interview saying something like you're moderately functional, and then
Mhm.
proceeded to tell us
All these amazing
all
things.
of
Oh,
this.
well,
And my
I
first I
don't
was
know.
like,
You'd
oh,
have to ask my
we're
son,
moderately functional,
whether
and then
I,
I'm like, oh no, we're not even on the spectrum of functional right now. That is incredible.
well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say. A lot of I'm not entirely sure I would be doing it obviously at the age I am now. I started to write books in my 50s, and so that's is it's a solitary activity, by the way. But that said, it requires a great deal of
Mm-hmm.
discipline. I mean, maybe it's because I'm not very good at it. I don't know. I don't know, but I mean, it does. In order to get the reviews and to have a readership, it requires a lot of discipline. You get up in the morning. And it's like anything else, you do the best you can. You write so many words a day, and then you edit them the next morning. And I've been very fortunate in that my agent has sold my projects on a, basis of proposals. But, and so I'm certainly not whining. I mean, I'm very privileged that way. And my publisher has always been Doubleday. But, the point is that, you sign a contract and it's coming with a delivery date and it's
Yep.
coming with, the obligation of so many pages. And you're on a schedule like anything else. You have
Mm-hmm.
to deliver on time. And so, but it's a very different creativity and that you're not dealing really with anyone else. I mean, I research, for the most
Mm-hmm.
part my books are about something I don't entirely understand or I've just been introduced to and I'm trying to sort it out. And so I write in a I think they even have a genre for it now. It's kind of narrative nonfiction. So I'm creating a story,
Mm-hmm.
and I am discovering, and the reader is at the same time what the subject is all about. And so in that way, it's great company. And on the other hand, it's a solitary activity.
Yeah.
That was something really interesting that came through in your book because it's kind of being narrated through Mr. Garnett as he's
Yes.
researching this woman who's
Yes.
come to him with this libel suit. He's like, "Who the hell is this lady?
Yeah,
What
she
is
just
going
came at him
on?"
like a bat out of hell.
Yeah.
Right.
So was that kind of your experience? Like, how did you find out about Victoria Woodhull? What inspired you to
Well,
write a book about
it
her?
was the same. I was, frankly, she had lived such a multifaceted life, with each life having a kind of unbelievable plot twist to it.
Hmm.
And actually, Mr. Garnett was indeed the head librarian, and he was indeed
Yeah.
included in the libel suit, and he was everything I described him to be. He was quintessentially an English academician
Yeah.
who lived in the museum. So, you can imagine what and so there was nothing, I didn't take liberties with him, but what I did do was use him as a kind of narrative device, which then allowed me to do two things. That it encouraged because as a former book publisher, I promise you, I'm very much aware of the fact that no reader is obliged to turn a page of a book,
Hmm.
right? So you have to create a story. And this was almost too much of a story.
Yeah.
So he was there to help us move forward through the story in a kind of very anecdotal way, but at the same time provide information. There was so much information because, she lived during the course of a century where there were so many changes, and she was extraordinary. And she went from rags to riches, from riches to rags, and then back to
Oh, yeah.
riches on two continents. And she provoked everybody along the way. And she survived everyone. I mean, they all just dropped away. She lived until she was 90.
Yeah. So, like, what was the inspiration from writing this book? Like, did you find out about her and then were like, I want to know
Yeah,
more?
that's
Or was it like,
no.
I'm going to
I
write a
mean,
book
that was
about her?
very, as is often the case with the ideas from it's happenstance, pure and simple. So my previous book is about this Leonardo da Vinci, this remarkable portrait called Lady with an Ermine, and I saw it for the first time. It's so heartbreakingly beautiful,
Hmm.
and it's relatively small. And I kind of stumbled upon it in the National Museum in Krakow. I didn't know it was there, and and it was so breathtakingly beautiful. I knew of the portrait, but I didn't understand how in God's name did it get to Krakow,
Yeah.
Poland. And so I decided to look into that. And fundamentally, I created a story of the portrait by way of its owners over 530 years. So this is not dissimilar in that I was invited to, to in between COVID lockdowns, the British Museum remained closed. But I was invited, they knew that I was a writer, and there was a library. I mean, this is so far-fetched. So there's a librarian, in within the British Museum. Now, the British Museum originally held all of the books that eventually became the British Library.
Hmm.
And the books weren't transported, until the 1990s. And so as you come into the courtyard of the British Museum, not many people realize, but under the winding staircase and under this wonderful, Norman Foster structure, when that literally where you're seeing the sky, but under that is a domed edifice that at one point held all the books that were housed in the British Museum. And so, as I said, they were all moved in the 1990s during COVID. And keep in mind, this was a year. So, I mean, we were all locked down. It
Hmm.
was very severe in London. There was a librarian who just looked as though she had stepped out of central casting, right? Very serious, very committed. On her own her remit was to organize or catalog what was left that weren't books.
Oh my
So, and I
gosh.
don't know. I mean, it was pretty kooky. I mean, I walked in
Yeah.
and there was the shell of an incendiary bomb that had come through
Gosh.
the
Yeah.
ceiling, during the Blitz. There were postcards from Karl Marx. And so, she was busy trying to organize a catalog system that listed these items. I wasn't sure what they were going to do with them, but I certainly wasn't going to ask any questions. She was very intense. Just the only thing I wondered was she was the only one who understood this system. So I just
Right.
was hoping, she'd stay healthy until. Anyway, the point is that on these shelves were these beautiful kind of blue vellum. I don't know how to describe them. They were wonderful old, they were catalogs of sorts, but on the side, with the spine, it
Hmm.
read Woodhull versus the British Museum. And I asked her, well,
Like, what
what
are
is this all
these?
about? And she put down her mask because we were all men. And she looked at me and said, that was another American woman, as though somehow I was there representing, the
Hmm.
complete,
It was another one of
total bitch
you
on
Yeah,
wheels
people.
who were,
exactly.
who were
Oof.
and I said, well, who was she? And she said, I don't know, but she caused a great deal of trouble here. So
You're like, I need to
I mean,
know
I
this
wanted to know
woman.
who the hell this woman was.
Okay.
And that's how it started.
I will say I did love, like, I was very confused at first, like, when
Mhm,
I started the book and I was like,
mhm,
who is this random dude? Like,
mhm,
but then, like, when it really got into it, like, I really enjoyed that plot telling device because it's right. It
mhm,
almost, Victoria lives a life that sounds like it's multiple people's lives, like, shoved into
mhm.
one story.
Yes.
But I gotta say, like, yeah, using the court as a way of like telling the story, I think was absolutely a genius idea.
Oh, well, thank you. But also it allowed her because that court scene was, in fact, I mean,
Yeah.
those folios, those were the transcripts of the trial, by the way, in perfect blue inked cursive handwriting.
Yeah, like
So, I
handwritten.
mean, I was sitting there
Love
with a
that
jeweler's loop.
aesthetic.
I mean, I went back to the archives to read them. And the point is that is her voice. That she was, man, she was not fooling around. She, as always, she was completely underestimated
Hmm.
with no education whatsoever. And and she insisted on speaking for herself, not through her solicitor. And the man, who was cross-examining her was in fact the Attorney General of the
Yeah.
UK. And, he himself was a trustee and he was, titled and he was Oxford educated and he was this and he was that. And she totally ground him down. I mean,
Yeah.
she was completely brilliant. But I also like the idea that and again, maybe I projected, this is where I did take liberties, that as the librarian was learning more about her, he was less judgmental.
Hmm.
And in the end, the way I ended was as it should have been, that she was so remarkable that even somebody like him thought twice about almost everything. So I thought that's the story arc.
Yeah.
Well, and he stands in as this, like you said, this quintessential British academic who's, very rooted in all those traditions that
Hmm.
Mhm,
Victoria is defying in the most extreme ways, and
mhm,
how he is. How you're able to use that juxtaposition between the two of them and his views and what she's doing,
Yeah.
but then also kind of that admiration, like she has got some guts.
Right.
My God, I
Yeah,
can't
no,
believe
she
she's
was,
doing
you know
this.
what she was more than any one thing? She was resilient. She
Oh
was
yeah.
many things. She was ambitious. I mean, this is the thing that made it sometimes a challenge for me to she was many things, some of them, she was a contrarian. So yes, she was a feminist. She was also, let's face it, a sexual opportunist.
Yeah.
And it could very well be that's exactly what women needed, to be at that
Hmm.
ambitious. Keep in mind, they had no rights. They had no legal rights. If they were married and they made money, it was going to the husband, who, by the way, could beat them legally.
Yeah.
She had no agency, and the more audacious she became and successful she became, the more notorious she became because she was just stepping outside of anything that let's face it, it was a male-driven
Yeah.
culture. What was thought of as appropriately female, and that was the same with the librarian who just thought she
Hmm.
was dangerous. She was not only an American, she was uneducated, her father was a con man, and she was successful and ambitious. So, you know, she was one of a kind, no doubt about it.
Yeah, definitely.
So we did an episode a few years ago where we covered Victoria Woodhull and her sister Tennessee Claflin, and I had always heard Victoria Woodhull, first woman to run for president,
Mhm.
full stop.
Yeah,
That
you
is
don't hear about most of the other
that is
stuff.
probably the least interesting
Yes,
thing
and that was
about
just
her.
part of her agenda. It
It-
wasn't, I mean, she ran for, I mean, just chronologically. So she supported the family as a child clairvoyant, and they were really nasty people. I mean,
Yeah, that wasn't
the
a,
father was
yeah.
abusive and exploitative. The mother was just crazy, and she also was abusive, and illiterate, and a zealot. But Victoria at a very early age was hugely precocious and had total recall. There were no books. Keep in mind, this is out in the middle of friggy nowhere,
Yeah.
in a small frontier outpost in Ohio. And they are so poor. There's no outhouse. There's nothing. The only water is a running stream. There are 9 other children, 2 of whom die in infancy. And so the father was always looking to scam the public,
Yeah.
and fundamentally, generate an income, where he didn't have to work. And so he recognized her, and to
Hmm.
a lesser degree, Tenny, the younger sister, and he promoted them as child clairvoyants. And they basically traveled, through the Midwestern states, and they sold, he was selling, or the wife was selling elixirs, which was quite
Yeah.
popular. It was fundamentally vegetable oil and, laudanum and, alcohol. So who wouldn't feel better, right?
Right.
And
Temporarily.
then she would either speak to the dead,
Hmm.
or, hands-on healing. And this was a time where, it was after the Civil War. There were so many people who you didn't know were ever coming back. It was impossible to
Yeah.
identify the remains of the dead. And at the same time, there was the electricity for the first time, and also the discovery of, basically the telegraph. So there was spiritualism, became a movement. It wasn't so
Hmm.
much religious as it was a cultural shift. And there was this sense that, well, if you could send signals through the air, you could also speak to the dead, but in a very life-affirming way. And that really was what was needed for, the people who were left behind to grieve had no way of grieving. And the kind of more traditional institutional churches were not very empathetic.
Yeah.
And so money was made. She supported the family. She then ran off at the age of 14 to marry somebody twice her age. He was hopeless. She encouraged, she basically organized, because, at that point, in order to take control of your life as a woman, you had to be, controlling in a very passive way, where you're trying to outwit it all, the family. And so she encouraged the husband to move to San
Hmm.
Francisco. Now, she insisted when she was a little girl that she had a visitation from a spirit guide who told her that she would become wealthy in a city surrounded on water, surrounded by ships. And then the second part, as she got older, was that she would become a leader of people. So first she married a man, and they went to Chicago, a city on a lake surrounded by ships. She didn't make money. They then went to San Francisco, hoping to take advantage of the gold rush, a city, surrounded with ships. They didn't make money. And each time she insisted she had the spirit guide basically informed her, what her next move should be. And this was again a way of using a proxy in order not to be accused
Hmm.
of, pushing ahead, and as the English would say, pushing in. And so she insisted that her spirit guide told her to return to the East Coast. And there she met, and she probably even stalked him. I mean, who knows? She went to New York and met and established a relationship. She brought Tanny with her, who was very kind of guileless and, quite lovely, and she enjoyed herself with men,
Yeah.
in a way that I'm not quite sure Victoria thought of them as kind of people to manage in order to get from A to B. But I think the younger sister really enjoyed herself. And so they both, there was this kind of two-prong approach to Vanderbilt, Cornelia Vanderbilt, who was also a spiritualist living in New York, and she zeroed in on him and fundamentally convinced him to take her on as an advisor, because she could speak to the deceased who would give him
Yeah.
advice on stocks. And then the younger, this Tenny, and keep in mind he was in his 70s, she clearly became his mistress.
Hmm.
And along the way, Victoria was very careful to learn about, she was obviously a very quick study, to learn about the stock market. And women were not allowed to trade, but she made her own fortune during Black Friday when the gold market collapsed and brought the stock market with it. And she sent men in to buy stock on the cheap, knowing that it would rebound. It
Yeah.
did. She made her own money. And then she decided at that point, okay, I've made money. Now I'm going to fulfill the prophecy and become a leader of people.
Hmm.
And so to do that, she decided to run for president. And to facilitate that, she decided to launch a weekly newspaper, which, by the way, I mean, she used again this orbit of men to kind of
Hmm.
curate the articles. The ideas were incredibly progressive and hugely forward thinking. So she was, endorsing an 8-hour workday. She was proposing labor unions. She was, insisting that it would benefit society if there was a national health care. She wanted to teach, sex education to children. And she even, and this is so out there, I mean, just remember what her background is. She proposed an international court of arbitration for trade,
Jeez.
if there were disagreements and discord in
Yeah.
terms of trade.
Thank God we
So
put all those issues to bed in the
no,
year of our
I
Lord 2025.
I know. And what is it? But in order to, she then obviously to a large degree, she understood that in order to cast a wide net, she would need to work with the suffragette movement.
Hmm.
They were very suspicious of her because she was really out of, she was a loose cannon. And the old guard thought also she was louche and, she was kind of
Yeah.
sleeping around or this. I mean, it was unseemly. On the other hand, she got things done. And so she was the first, as always, the first woman to do any number of things, but she lobbied and was then given the right to address a congressional hearing about
Hmm.
the women's right to vote. And, it took them 50 years later to,
Yeah.
agree to it. But so, and then what happened was along the way, she was kind of, followed by this very creepy guy by the name of Anthony Comstock, who you may know, from
Hmm.
the
Oh yeah.
Comstock Law. Yeah,
Yeah,
he was
sucks.
really,
He sucks
and
real
he was
hard.
obsessed with stamping out pornography, and he was especially suspicious of literature. And so in New York, he would identify what he considered to be, very dangerous bookstores that had,
Oh, jeez.
lewd books in them and work with the police. And so they would raid the bookstores and shut them down. And so, at any rate, he realized, and this is where it's sounding extremely familiar, recently, he realized that in order to cast a wider control, that he volunteered not to take a salary. I mean, does this not sound familiar?
Hmm.
And lobby for a non-voting role, again, familiar.
Hmm.
Nobody voted him into a federal position within the Postal Service. So he knew that basically by giving him a reach
Yep.
across state lines, he would be in a better position to arrest and incarcerate whoever he really wanted. And, if he had a cause, and in this case, he had kind of orchestrated a situation where he had somebody in one state, whether it was New Jersey or Connecticut, request a copy of Victoria's newspaper, which then was mailed across state lines. And on that premise, he had her arrested and incarcerated. So, in fact, she was in jail when the election, occurred. whether or not I think she might have been on the ballot, but as an independent.
Yeah.
But she got out of prison and everything fell apart. She had lost her newspaper. She lost her, understandably, the brokerage house. She couldn't lecture, which is how she had also made money. She was very popular because she had a respiratory ailment from having been in jail, in a dank. And this is another kind of you couldn't make this up from fiction. Um, the Vanderbilt family was very anxious that she and her sister Tenny would blackmail them
Yeah.
because he was
I
on his
remember that.
deathbed. And so they just said, here's $200,000, which was a huge amount of money.
Hmm.
And we will give this to you if you pledge never to leave this country and never return.
Yeah, just
And
like
that
leave
is
us
how they
alone.
ended up in the UK.
I want to
Crazy.
become enough of a problem for someone with
That
where
someone
they
pays you to
literally
leave.
pay me to leave the United States. Like here's some money, go somewhere else. I don't care where, you pick. Like that's how much of a problem I want to be for people.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm afraid you'd probably be thrown in jail, or
Oh
I don't
yeah,
know what would
definitely.
happen. I don't think they
Exactly.
have that same business model anymore.
Yeah. So I mean, like Victoria lived this like truly wild, unthinkable life, especially for the time. Was there anything that like really shocked you the most about her and her life, or?
What was, I don't know whether it was shocking. It was very sobering. And it was also, I admired it that she was addressing issues that, we're still addressing today. What did surprise me was that she was so little known. And, it's just as you both have said, she's kind of the footnote, where she was the first
Hmm.
woman who, ran for that was part of a larger, story that is as a whole is kind of staggering. And
Yeah.
in that way, I was surprised, and who could not admire her? She was an opportunist, and I think she also enjoyed the celebrity. And so she at times was her own worst enemy. She kind of
Hmm.
overstepped herself. But what happened was she ended up in the UK, and she decided she was 40, which is kind of stale bread, right, for a woman of that, in that
Oh
era.
yeah.
As a
So 40 years,
year-old can confirm,
yes,
I'm very
not
stale.
anymore, not so much anymore, but then it was really beyond middle age. The
Oh
point is,
yeah.
she zeroed in on one of the most eligible. He was so dashing. Yeah, he was, the fifth generation. His name is John Martin, the fifth generation Martin family. It was a very prestigious banking
Hmm.
family that was older than the Bank of England.
Yeah.
And he went to Oxford, and he was a rower, and he did this and he did that. And he was very good looking, and he was younger. And she got him to the altar. And that was the point at which, and by the way, his mother, basically said, over my dead
Yeah.
body.
She's like, don't do this. This is a bad
Yeah, and
idea.
and she said to him, she sent her son off to Europe saying, just leave. And eventually this woman will go away. Well, what Victoria did was she just pretended as though they
Hmm.
were already husband and wife, and she would write him every day, my dearest husband, and she'd sign it, your devoted wife. She just pretended as though they were already married. And then when he finally came back, she had already bought her own engagement ring. So that's
Yeah.
how.
She's like, this is what's happening.
But that was the point at which, bringing it full circle, that was the point at which she wanted to be respected and respectable.
Yeah.
And she'd forgotten that, there was US press that had described her in vivid detail. And she found that in the British Library, which was part of the British Museum. And that is why she brought the libel case. She
Yeah.
wanted to dry clean, so to speak, her reputation. So that brings it full circle.
That had to be like a shocking thing to like walk into a museum and see this like pamphlet that you're included in and just be like, well, shit. Like,
I
Yeah,
also
no, she's sort, it's like the Jeffrey Epstein thing where you think somehow those emails are not
yeah,
going to
just never,
bubble up
yeah,
to the
exactly.
surface.
Like it
yeah,
always will.
I also want to be enough of a problem where Actually, no, I don't want to be a problem. I wish that's how my parents dealt with my last relationship because it was not okay. I wish they just sent me off to Europe.
Yeah. Just
Yeah,
saying,
no,
like,
I
Stop
know,
dating
I
this
know,
guy.
but
He's
then you've got
toxic.
somebody who's waiting for you, who's,
Yeah,
I mean, it was
exactly.
she was just
my
unbelievable
ex
and
was not as
completely
enterprising,
shameless.
though. My ex was not as
Yeah.
enterprising as Victoria. He would have let that. He'd be like, okay, she's gone, moving on.
Well,
Oh my
Victoria
So
gosh.
had no
crazy.
intention of moving on. What she wanted was often what she got beyond anybody's wildest dreams.
I
I
mean,
mean, against all odds, she usually got what she wanted.
it sounds like she just kind of made it happen, like you said, like
Yeah, she
writing the
did.
letters like they were already married, buying her own engagement ring. She was
Yeah,
like,
no, I
this is
love
what
the
I
idea
want.
that you've taken care of the engagement ring. She obviously, she somehow encouraged him to the altar. He was, by the way, they were happy once they were married, although he
Okay.
did predecease her, and his father predeceased him by 3 days. She was the
Wow.
only heir, so she ended up irreversibly rich.
That's crazy.
I
It's
know,
a
isn't it
lot of like
great?
it's so funny because spirituality is so tied to her and her story.
Hmm.
Whether sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not she really believes in it, like her spirit guide,
Yeah, I don't know.
Demasta.
I don't know. I mean, at the age of 5 and 6, she described her first
Hmm.
visitation. It was extremely specific. Keep in mind, there are no books anywhere out in the middle
Yeah.
of nowhere. And she is describing, a Greek philosopher who shows up in white robes. And I mean, where would she even know? So whether or not it was her way of dealing with an incredibly depressing,
Yeah.
relentlessly abusive childhood and escaping it into fiction, or whether she did go into a trance, it's difficult to know, but she certainly used it then as a pivotal point. Whenever she made a decision, she would announce it by insisting that she had heard from her spirit guide. So he became, he was very
Yeah.
handy.
Well, I was gonna
Well,
say it's a great way to be like, well, it wasn't me. This wasn't my
Yeah,
decision.
no, and she had to do that because the society culture wouldn't have stood for a woman who pushed forward and, with her elbows out.
and it's, that whole idea of manifesting or
Mhm.
speaking your
Yeah.
intention to
Mhm.
manifest the outcome that's so
Mhm.
popular today. That's literally what she was doing.
Yes, yes.
It's
Yeah, no, she
amazing.
was, I don't know what to say. I don't think I could imagine anybody like her even
No.
today.
Like you said, like you were like, it's stranger than fiction, like
It is,
it
it
almost
was,
seems
but
too much to make up.
yeah. But on the other hand, I say good on her,
Yeah.
right? I mean, who could not admire her?
What
Respect the hustle.
Yeah. I mean,
I
what do
know.
you think motivated her resiliency? Because she did
I don't
face
know. She was
intense
just one of
backlash.
these, she was a force of nature. And
Yeah.
you often see, I mean, you do hear occasionally, but it usually is on one single plane where somebody has managed to, outwit
Yeah.
all of the odds against them. But it's not across so many different venues or, and she utilized everything, politics, sex,
Yeah.
progressive legislation, oration. She was a brilliant speaker. So she just tapped into anything she needed to utilize.
Yeah, because by the time she even moves to England, yeah, she's facing backlash not only from men who don't like that she's
Mhm.
coming into their space, but like even women in the suffrage movement, like there
Yeah,
were
they
a
didn't
lot of
like her.
people speaking
If
out
you
about
looked, they
against
pulled
her.
together I can't remember whether it was Fawcett and Susan Anthony. They pulled together a
Hmm.
kind of a book of the history of at the time. And she didn't even make it into the index or footnote. I mean, so they made a point of expunging her because she was just
Yeah,
too
that she's
much. But
too radical.
she
Like,
was, and
yeah.
also she didn't know when to stop. So for example, she decided to cast a wide net in the run up for presidency. Which of course was impossible. She couldn't vote. She also was too young. You had to be 35. Anyway, she was going to make a point. And so she decided, okay, well, I've got this, the suffragettes are kind of wafting away. I've got the spiritualists. They're kind of, digging me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go after, the communists, and Marx had been, she was the
Mhm.
first one, by the way, to reprint Karl Marx's manifesto in her
Jeez.
weekly in English, right? But
Wow.
at the same time, she was running a brokerage house. Well, that is not going to work well, right? I mean,
No.
you can't be both at the same time. You can't be a communist and then a
And she's
capitalist.
like, but I
So
can be.
no, I mean, so she lost, she started to lose clients, but then she was also wanted to kind of expand the agenda, of the manifesto and, Marxism here in New York. There was a chapter and she became a member and then she became president of this and that. And then she just decided, okay, well, I'll add certain things, sexual freedom for women. And it got back to Karl Marx's,
Yeah.
hub in London, and he just said, "Who the hell is this woman?" I mean, it's like, who is she? And she's causing too much trouble.
Yeah.
And so they took her communist card away, and she just thought, "Well, that's fine. I'll just move on to something else."
Yeah, like there was always something else that she was kind of like, okay, well, that's plan B.
Well,
Yeah,
and
no, I didn't even know whether, I mean, I see what you're saying. I'm not quite sure she even had a plan B. I think she simply moved on to whatever she saw was out
That's
there.
impressive.
well,
So, but what she certainly lacked, and it became almost incremental, the more well-known she became, was a level of common sense, because
Okay.
she didn't know she was pushing too much. And I don't mean about the concept. Her tactics were not doing her, a great service.
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense considering her upbringing because her parents
Hmm.
do not have a moral compass. It's very
No.
self-serving
Yeah.
and they do these outrageous things. They pull these outrageous scams. And then
Hmm.
when it doesn't work or it catches up with them,
Yeah,
there's
she
like,
Move
just
on.
it
when
goes
they're
for the
met with
next.
abject failure, they're like, okay, we're going to do something different now. And
Yeah, or
that
they
like
moved to the next town.
reinventing.
I mean,
Exactly.
the father Buck, who was a one-eyed con guy. I mean, he was just creepy and awful, by the way. I mean, really, reprehensible. And and he was, there were many times that, the townspeople threatened to tar and feather him, and he would just pick up and leave to the next town. And it's not as though you could communicate, town
Yeah.
by town. So, there was then it was easy pickings in the next town, and then they'd twig onto him and push him. But he would just, he didn't have a problem. He would just
Yeah.
move
It's
around.
just like,
Yeah.
okay, you don't like what I'm doing. I'll just keep going. And yeah, it's like she
Yeah,
almost
and
did
he would
learn
drag
that.
his children with
Yeah.
him, and most especially Victoria and Tenny, who,
Yeah.
it was men, well, fathers and husbands had total control. They
Yep.
could put their children and their wives to work, and
It didn't
they,
matter.
nobody had any legal rights. And so, he had these little girls working, 13-hour days.
And, her running off at 14
Hmm.
with a guy to marry him to escape the
Hmm.
family. I mean,
Makes sense.
that's something we still see today. It's such a common
Yeah.
trope, especially with, troubled young women or women who come
Hmm.
from
Yeah,
dysfunctional
it's the only way
households
of
is to
escaping is
find a
through another
guy
man.
to get
Yeah,
them out.
exactly. That
Yeah.
moved them out. I mean, she understood. I mean, I understand completely. She believed that she would take a chance on a man she didn't know to escape a man she knew all too well,
Yeah.
who was a nasty piece of work.
God.
I
No,
know.
sorry. Her parents sucked
Yeah,
so
her-
hard.
Yeah.
It was also really, but what was really interesting, and we didn't really get into this when we, read about Victoria Woodhull in Tennessee.
Mhm.
They kept their parents around as much as Victoria wanted to
Mhm.
escape them. They've still very much kept them close, enabled
Yeah.
That's
them,
true.
took
That's the
care of
family.
them.
That's the family.
And that's so
Yeah.
common in abusive family dynamics where it's, the children who have been
Mhm.
victimized still feel that responsibility and
Yes,
that,
yes, yeah.
duty to their
I
parents
know.
who continue
I
to
would have left
suck.
them behind
Yeah.
so quickly.
Well, because they
But they
kept
were, well,
victimizing
first of
their
all, they were like
kids.
limpets. They always showed up. So as
Yeah.
soon as there was a sense that there was cash flow in another state, and they would show up. But she would never kick them out. And she tried to clean up their reputation when she moved to London, she insisted that her father was, related to the King of Scotland, and the mother was, a German princess. It was just wacky. And of course, she didn't quite understand that, especially in the UK, there's
Yeah,
documentation that
there's
goes
such
back to the
extensive
Norman
records.
conquest in terms of the families. So it was very easy to debunk. But that didn't keep her from suing the British Museum, the most august
Yeah.
institution in the UK, because she just didn't want, her backstory, available to the public.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the things that she was advocating for and facing at the time seem awfully and frustratingly familiar in our modern day society. What are some of the parallels that you see in criticisms between, what Victoria was facing at the time and what women politicians are facing today?
Well, I mean, let me answer that with a kind of, it's not really a rhetorical question, but just, I suppose it is, which is, I'm not sure what it will take for Americans to vote for a woman, a capable woman for president. I don't, I've lived in many, many places outside of America. And, I remember I wrote an article, a couple of months ago about, well, it was actually on the heels of the last election. And I counted some 48 countries, um, where what was either assigned or elected was a woman
Mm-hmm.
leader. So, and I don't, in cultures that are kind of it's almost counterintuitive, because the cultures are not necessarily, advanced, in terms of
Yeah.
women's rights. So I don't know. I don't know what it is. I think that I don't know. What do you both think? Why is it so difficult when there is a capable woman? And we don't have to discuss the ins and outs of the last two, but just in theory, why do you suppose that is?
I mean, our whole society is, has those puritanical
Mhm.
roots and is built with the structure of white supremacy, which is
White
inherently
male
which is
supremacy.
inherently
Yeah.
related to the patriarchy. And I think it's interesting. So in history, we saw that black men earned the right to vote
Hmm.
before white women.
Yes,
And
that's
I
right.
I really
Hmm.
think that we're going to see that repeat where, when
Yep.
a woman is finally elected president, I think it's going to be a white woman because we had a black man as president
Mhm.
because the
Yeah.
race was a less, for these conservatives and in,
It was
our
easier
white
to digest.
it was less of an
Yeah.
offense to conservative
Mhm.
traditionalist people, but gender is still, it's like, well,
Yeah,
regardless of
I
your
don't
race, if you're a
know. I
man,
think,
we get
that's an
mad.
interesting point. I mean, I've lived in the UK for the last 10 years, and I've seen two women who are, I
Yeah.
mean, they weren't wildly capable, but I mean, there were issues involved. But the point is, they were both from the Tory party. I mean, so,
Yeah.
and I've seen that before, where it's a conservative party that basically moves the women ahead. And I don't know whether it's because the issues are very clear. So, and
Yeah.
in the UK, you're fundamentally voting for a platform.
Right. Yeah. Whereas here
And
it's
the
very much a
platform is
person.
conveyed, and forgive the word, but they use it in a manifesto. And so those are the issues. That is how they're going to run the government. And so you are voting for that. And theoretically, assuming they get into power, that is precisely what they do. In other words, they are judged on whether or not they are delivering. And the,
Yep.
the manifesto is very clear. It's, often just kind of 5 points or, um, so I think in that way, it's easier to have almost a parliamentary, government where fundamentally you're held to account. In other words, you get in, you know what you do, and also the gender doesn't mean that's the
Yeah.
platform you have to deliver. So I don't know. It's a mystery to me.
I think
It's
it's
just it's
also
beyond me.
it's interesting that you mentioned how conservative politics tend to move women forward,
Hmm.
because that was one of the issues between Victoria and the suffragists. They were more conservative.
Yeah, and she was way more
She was
radical.
way too progressive and out there, because
Yes,
if
yes.
a conservative woman
Hmm.
is, stepping into a man's realm of
Uh-huh.
politics, well, she's the right kind of woman.
Yeah, yeah,
She
that could
still
be.
knows
I,
her place in a way.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what happened with Victoria is that she showed up. Quite honestly, the suffragette movement was split already.
Yep.
And what happened was they stepped aside. They did the right thing during the Civil War. They stepped aside and they focused on abolition, and then with the kind of implicit understanding that after the war people would swing behind the right for women to vote, and that did not happen right away. They've fundamentally concentrated on the a black man's right to vote. By the way, no black women, but
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so, and there was one half of, I mean, it's not that pat, but there was a sector of the movement
Hmm.
that was kind of very, obviously very disappointed, but, had a kind of very collaborative, well, let's wait and we'll
Yeah.
work this out. And then there was the second half that just thought, well, screw this, we're going to burn it down. We're going to
Yeah.
attack
We'll
the
burn it all
institution. And
down.
so
Yeah.
Victoria was of that mind, but she also was not very, again, this is a point where the nuance of dealing with people, she
She kind of
simply
lacked
hadn't
it.
utilized it, because she insisted that she was, while they were kind of whining about the vote, she had gone out, she had made money, she had supported herself. And her argument was one of complete pure logic in front of, the men. She said, look, I have made money. I have created jobs. I have paid taxes, and I am not allowed to vote. So she came at it in a
Yeah.
hugely logical way, but that still didn't move the needle.
Well, and I think too, probably because a lot of men were like, yeah, but that's not the average woman. Most average women aren't going to create jobs or make their own money because their husbands own them. So, like, I think that probably also hurt her cause of just
Mhm.
like Emily said, sometimes it's like, well, you're not the mold of the woman we would want,
Yeah,
and you're not like the
yeah.
standard.
Well, I don't, I mean, to bring Mr. Garnett back in the loop, I mean, he was, this is Victorian,
Yeah.
the perception of women. And there was a queen, obviously, but she was very much a mother figure to,
Yeah.
the country. And he just thought that this was somebody who landed from a different planet.
Right.
It was counter to everything he knew about being female. She was, aggressive. But eventually then she proved herself in a way that is inarguable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was kind of like a Victorian era manic pixie dream girl.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It's so
I have a
funny.
visual.
Well,
Yeah.
because I kept, you're talking about her relationships with men and how they're like, you're not like other girls. You're passionate, outspoken, you've lived this crazy, and you're kind of weird, but in all the right ways. I'm like, oh my God, she is a manic pixie dream girl.
Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah,
And it was
I think she
amazing.
was more a nightmare than, in
For
other
some
words, they
people,
were so,
definitely.
Pixie
yeah, they
nightmare.
really didn't want this on their radar screen.
Yeah.
They were afraid that there would be others like her.
Yeah, I think that is
And you
exactly
know
it.
what? I'll tell you something, speaking, as a woman of a certain age, regardless of nationality or culture, the one thing that allows women freedom
Hmm.
is financial
Oh
self-sufficiency.
yeah.
And
100%.
so, that was between, quite honestly, in my generation, I was a generation beyond, the pill. But that was it. You could earn your own living and take care of yourself, and you could have sex whenever it suited you, and not be fearful
Yeah.
of getting pregnant. And I think that, that is, a formidable combination. And, it's now in the process of being reviewed
Apparently,
by
yeah.
very conservative church-going men. So, well, I mean, I shouldn't say just men, but so, who would have guessed that I wouldn't have, that
Yeah.
somehow we're revisiting these very fundamental issues that you thought 50 years ago were And it's Anthony Comstock is kind of alive and well.
Yeah.
I just have to say, for a dude who loved the Bible so much, he hated smut. I'm like, have you read the Bible?
Yeah.
It is
Well, he was
filthy.
hugely he was in the Union Army, and
Yeah.
he almost was thrown out because he preached, among his about the fellow soldiers about the evil of masturbation. And that's
Yeah.
not really going to fly when
Well,
you're,
In the
and he
middle of
was
nowhere
and he was
forever.
so anti-drinking to the point where he would take like his little ration of whiskey and then dump it out in front of everyone. Like he wouldn't even just give it to someone else. He's like, this belongs on the ground.
Yeah.
They filled his bed with garbage. They hated that dude.
Yeah.
And it's so
Yeah, yeah.
interesting to see these wildly unpopular people
Uh-huh.
still
Uh-huh.
have that like pull. I'm like,
Oh no,
he was
he had
a
a huge,
loser.
he had enormous authority. And what he did, he wasn't stupid, by the way. He was creepy, but he wasn't stupid. So he realized that if he had the church, the extreme, whatever you wish to call them, Christians behind, the church
Yep.
goers behind him, that Congress would kind of cave, and they weren't paying attention. And so and he deliberately went to Washington and lobbied for this law, and there was so much leeway. I mean, it was definitely trampled the First Amendment,
Yeah.
but they were careless.
Yeah.
And so he started to ban medical books. That had illustrations of, obviously, I mean, if you're cutting into somebody,
Yeah,
you have
like you
to
need
actually
it.
look.
Yeah.
You have to understand the larger picture. But he also raided the Arts Students League in New York because they were
That's
painting
crazy.
from nude models. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't
Monster.
know.
As
I don't
as a
know.
nude model myself, I take great offense to that.
Which
Because it
is
is
just crazy.
I
too,
would
like,
say
that
it is
just-
also like the least sexual thing you can do with your
It
clothes
didn't
off.
matter. I mean, anatomy
Exactly.
books, you can't,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's
Yeah.
about as asexual as you can get, or
Right.
non-sexual or whatever. And he wanted those off the shelves too. He
That's
was a bad piece
insane.
of work
And
and, crazy.
we still
Yeah.
see these people who they defy logic, they defy, they can be creepy, they can
Mhm.
all of these things, but if they are able to convince other people that they have that moral
Yeah.
authority, that seems to
Mhm.
supersede everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as somebody who's lived in countries as an American where I've witnessed, civil rights being diminished,
Hmm.
I'm perhaps, first of all, more grateful for my own as an American, but I'm also perhaps more aware of the political threads. And it happens very slowly. You don't necessarily, and
Hmm.
then it happens very quickly.
Yeah.
And so, I'm hoping that that isn't the case in my own country, but it takes a level of dissatisfaction
Yeah.
that and there's no doubt, obviously, that was bubbling up for many, many years, and it wasn't acknowledged, and it takes a person or a party then to galvanize that this the dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
But it also then, the only thing that holds that in check is an opposition party. So that has to, and again, it's unfair to compare, but it's interesting to see that in the UK, there is a counter to every cabinet position. So there is,
Okay.
somebody in charge of finance, but then they call it the shadow and that person is constantly, once a week during Prime Minister's question, they are constantly questioning, and you have to show up and have answers. And that's televised for everybody to see. So, I mean, if you have that, I'm not suggesting that the UK has got all the answers. I mean, they're in trouble along with everybody else. And there's, Boris Johnson, who's having parties during COVID lockdown and so on and so on. But the point is that the system is such that, it requires you to be, first of all, fact-based, and especially with the BBC that is there, rigorously trying to fact check something. But there is a constant opposition. So
Yeah.
you have to be able to account for the decisions or the actions made. And there, for whatever reason, that has all but disappeared here in America. And until there's somebody who can galvanize that, it's, they're just, everything is just it's very nebulous.
I
Yeah.
was going to say that whole idea of someone in government being questioned and then being held accountable for what they
Yes.
say and having to tell the truth and actually prove their point using facts and
Just seems
logic.
to go by the
I'm
wayside
like, I'm
lately.
like, I wonder what that's like. Like, it's,
Yeah, well, at least there's an attempt,
Yeah.
and also there is still shame involved. So, I mean, I remember the first year I was in the UK and somebody did something really inexcusable, and of course they were fired immediately. And during the prime minister's, there was basically, and they're rowdy. I mean, they, tap their, or they wave their, but basically, I mean, what they were shouting was shame, shame. And you just think, well, where's that? That doesn't,
Yeah.
where do you find that anymore?
oh,
Right.
yeah.
It's a shame, many situations where you realize it's shameless, really. I mean,
Yeah.
that doesn't shame doesn't enter into the picture now as often as it used to. I
Yeah,
suppose that's
Yeah.
the
the show Shameless was not supposed to be an instructional guide, but maybe rather a
Yeah.
warning about the
Mhm.
lack of shame.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't mean
Yeah.
to,
Oh,
veer us
you're
into
fine.
something,
I mean, honestly,
depressing.
we're women's history.
Yeah.
It's kind of
That's always
depressing.
there, yeah.
Okay.
You know, history in general. And that's one of the things that I think have drawn both Kelly and I to history, like since we were kids. I was always into like the American Civil War, the Holocaust, civil rights, like all of the really dark and depressing stuff, because that was the most fascinating thing to me. I didn't expect to be reliving some of these things today. I'm like, oh, thank God we figured all that out in like the 40s and 30s and all that. But
Well, I mean, it's
it's
good to stay
inevitable.
involved because the
Yes.
only way to correct it is to address it,
Yeah.
and for that you need to stay involved. And
Point it out.
it's democracy works as long as people care to uphold it. So,
Exactly.
100%.
at any rate, we all do what we can, I think, or we
Yeah.
should.
Um, bringing it back to,
Mhm.
to Victoria, but
Good
still in the
segue.
political spectrum, actually. We mentioned, yeah, like that most people today probably know Victoria because of her little footnote of running for
Right.
president. But it sounds like at the time, like she wasn't taken super seriously. And she tried more than once, which I find interesting. But I remember when we covered her, it almost seemed not maybe comical, but like there was just like this aspect to it that didn't seem serious, because I remember when we covered her, there was like an excerpt from something that someone asked, I think it was Frederick Douglass, that was going to be her vice president, and he was
When
like, I don't even
she
know who
put
this
him on
woman is.
no, okay, well, I mean, that's a typical Woodhull because so she put him on her ticket as the vice president without asking him. He
Yeah.
knew nothing about it. He kind of heard about it. I mean, she was audacious, and I don't know, we just keep on returning to her various characteristics, and she was that. And, I guess that's what it took. But she wasn't, she wasn't maligned until it all started to accumulate.
Okay.
She was criticized, and she was kind of, people were in a kind of state of disbelief. But it's difficult it's difficult not to admire her
Yeah.
entirely
I mean, really,
because she stumbled a couple of, and she was
yeah,
her own
Yeah.
worst enemy, which I guess is not as human, right?
yeah.
Well, I think we almost see that in her running for presidency. Like me and Emily were briefly talking about this before we started, and it was like, yeah, like that first run was so big and so amazing, but then it's like as she runs again and again, it gets like a little
Yeah,
bit
no, no.
sadder
She
each
wanted to keep
time,
herself. Well, she ran, multiple times from twice more from the
Yeah.
UK because she wanted that imprimatur of
Okay.
respectability. She wanted to be seen by, and of course they had no interest in that, especially the
Yeah.
upper class. They're not interested in much of anything, much less, an American woman who's showing up, trying to trying to convince them to
Yeah.
accept her.
Hmm.
So, at any rate, she did keep at it.
Yeah.
I-
Which is admirable.
So many times while reading the book, I just was shaking my head. I'm just like, the audacity of this
Right.
bitch.
Like I can't imagine.
In equal
My
parts,
anxiety would stop me so many times.
and in equal parts, like there were some times where, of course, she is a fallible character. She does not have the moral high ground very often. And so sometimes it was like almost in disgust, and sometimes it was just in awe, like, oh my God.
No. I mean, you have to get handed to her, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like she's just, I think that's what makes her so amazing. Cause like,
Yeah.
whether she's soaring high or she is a train wreck, you just cannot look away from her.
Yeah. No, I think you both could have it right.
Yeah.
So Woodhull, like throughout her life, she had this really close partnership and relationship with her sister, Tennessee Claflin, and it was vital to her career. Oftentimes they were business partners, they were scammers, they were romancing, kind of
they like worked in tandem.
each other's wing women, all of this stuff. So what are your thoughts on their relationship, what it revealed about, women's solidarity or even rivalry? Because they did have a falling out later on. Like they had as much of a complicated relationship.
I mean, I think what happened was at one point, Tennessee decided she also wanted a public face, but I don't think that was the falling out. And they were, they acted in a very symbiotic way. And I often, and I researched, I mean, it's ridiculous to somehow apply it to, some sort of psychological state of mind, but, they grew up in a hugely abusive environment. And I think that the reason that they worked so closely together and were close, in fact, was survival.
Yeah.
And they were very practical. First of all, they were, they kind of beat all the odds because I don't know what happened to the gene pool, but they were actually quite beautiful. I mean, Tanny was, kind of voluptuous and Victoria was more, dignified and rather remote in her beauty. But the point is that they were very attractive. And they were also hugely practical. And I don't know, it could very well be that Victoria believed in the spirits. I never thought that Tenny did, although she was great on stage. She enjoyed being on stage. So she, moved herself into kind of a faux state of, trance and so on and so forth. But I don't know. I honestly don't know what happened. Tenny ended up marrying an equally rich Englishman whose family owned most of the silk fabric and cotton. I mean, it was an incredibly advantageous marriage, and he was a kind of a captain of industry, but he took to her immediately because she was so kind of charming and. I don't think she zeroed in on him, but she might have. I mean, they're just instinctively they go for the cash flow.
Yeah.
And why not, right?
Well, that was the way the system was set up. I think it's easy for us to criticize the kind of, maybe gold digger mentality, but that was literally the only way for women to secure their financial future.
Yeah, I agree. I understand. I understand precisely what you're saying. At any rate, they both work strategically, and they both together and individually enjoyed a great deal of luck.
Yeah. Well,
but they created their own luck. So, and that's often the case.
Well, and I do think you're right. I think there was this level of like safety in each other, especially like as they became this duo. Like even their parents were like, yep, you're a duo and like you're this show. And I think that built this like safety and like kind of knowing like I have this other person that even when I'm in this horrible situation with our parents, like I have this other person who's here with me.
Yes,
and they like carried that into
they were
adulthood.
very much a team. So, good story, right?
Right.
Yes. Oh, sorry, it's my turn.
I'm like,
I was like, we're just
Oh
looking at
God,
each
I
other.
know. I don't
Kelly,
know.
I want
We
to
try to
step on.
swap off on story.
I don't want to step on your
questions.
toes
That's
here,
so
but I'm
funny.
just going to start talking.
No, you're fine. So, in all that we've talked about with Victoria, like, what do you hope readers are going to take away from your book and her story?
Well, I'm hoping there's the acknowledgement that such a woman existed. The first and foremost, because she wasn't really known. I didn't know about her. Not that
Mm-hmm.
somehow I'm emblematic of what you should know, but
Yeah.
I also hope that what they see is a complicated person whose instincts, both good and bad,
Mm-hmm.
resided in a woman who was just fiercely determined. And she did, she did make a difference by
Yeah.
addressing issues that, she was so ahead of her time. So in that way, I think it's encouraging to know that against all odds, somebody can be so forceful and resilient. And, yes, a lot of it was, luck, but she, as I said, she created her own luck and she just outlasted everybody. And
Yeah.
she did make a profound difference, I think. And so in that way, I'm hoping, just as I was surprised and delighted and kind of relieved to know that somebody like this could exist, and keep in mind, this was before any communication,
Oh, yeah.
really, any transportation. The idea that she did what she did at the time she did it and the era she did it is really quite extraordinary.
Well, and I think it shows, like, if someone can do it then, someone could do it now.
I hope so. I hope so. Or even they don't have to do it all the way
Right, like,
she did
bits
all
and
at
pieces,
once, but they
maybe.
can choose one thing to do
Yeah,
Exactly.
and
maybe
move
they
it forward.
maybe they study her and identify some of the potholes
Yeah.
and drive around those.
Yeah.
I there must be something in the water or in the universe right now. Not to get super spiritual, though I think Victoria would appreciate that.
Probably.
I just got done reading books about Madame Restel, this famous abortionist in New York, and then
Yes.
Mamie Fish, famous socialite,
Yeah.
also in New England,
Which is crazy.
around the same time. And so there are all these like like Comstock appears in all of these books. I'm always like,
Oh
God,
my
can
God,
we get
yes,
rid
he's
of this
probably,
bitch?
he's like a rabid dog.
Well, he is.
It's one of those
and he
things,
went
like,
after everyone.
Well, and it sucks because it's like, why is he remembered by history, but like these women aren't? Because like these are the people we should talk about and bring
Right.
forward.
But what's
But I mean,
so
the Comstock law stayed on the books for quite some time,
Yeah.
I think into the
Crazy.
1920s. And it wasn't just women he was after. I mean,
Right.
It was everything.
he
Yeah.
was just casting an incredibly wide net. And I love the idea. He went after Walt Whitman for Leaves of Grass
Wow.
and his collection of, and apparently it piqued such public curiosity that in fact it increased the royalties. So he got more money as a
Yeah.
result of that.
So he's probably like, thanks.
Yeah. So I don't know, but I think they're good and they're bad people out there at the risk
Yeah.
of really simplifying it. She was a little of
Yeah.
both, by the way, but what she did was great good.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what I found so interesting. Madame Restel and Mamie Fish, very, very similar.
Yeah.
Highly intelligent,
Oh, yeah.
incredibly ambitious,
Ahead of their time.
also their own worst enemies. They
Yes,
all
yes.
at one point jump the shark.
Yeah.
And they can't read the room anymore. And that all of these women were existing and doing, in their own field, but very similar
Oh,
things
yeah.
and having these very similar stories and trajectories. It's like, even though Victoria is exceptional
One
as
of
a
a
person,
kind.
there were plenty of women like this. It's not like, oh, well, all the women were just doing their sewing and their housework and
I
their
mean,
childbirthing. And then there was this lady.
It's not like we didn't base a six year on podcast on that premise.
Exactly. But it's been so cool to read all three of these books in a row
Yeah, I bet,
and
I
seeing
bet.
the parallels and, the business acumen and how they
Yeah.
weaponized their sex.
I think my theory is that if you are unable, if the very thing that allows you, propels you ahead, with such determination, probably prevents you from knowing
Yeah.
how to kind of slow down or, just sort out how to take the detour or so. I mean, there's not, as I said, there, somehow there's a lack of nuance. So anyway, that's my theory.
I think that's a good theory.
So this is kind of a fun question. If you could ask Victoria Woodhull any question, and like, what would it be?
Oh God, well, so that's I think that I would, on a personal note, I would want to know why she had a falling out with her sister, with
Yeah.
whom she had such a close relationship. And on a professional note, I would want to know whether she ever had regrets,
Yeah.
in terms of what she did or how she did it. I don't know whether I've spent so much time in the back of the book, you can see chapter by chapter how many books I read my way through about the, time and the tension, the kind of the issues that orbited around her from, decade to decade. What I don't know is she was remained a mystery. She was very enigmatic, and I don't know whether she was actually self-reflective.
That would be
I think she
interesting.
just moved forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there was no
But
like
at any
looking
rate,
back.
but she was certainly an interesting subject on which to write a book.
Yeah.
I
or
would
about which.
also just love to hear how she would answer a question because it's not going to
Yeah.
be direct, and the truth may be woven in there, but it's not going to be front and center.
Yeah.
She doesn't give anything away.
There's that icebreaker question that's like, oh, if you could like invite any 2 or 3 people to dinner, like who, like a dinner party, and like I think Victoria would be on my list now, just because I'm like, she would be so fascinating because it's like
She
she
but I
would
would
want to
guess that
control
she'd
the
take
room.
over the dinner conversation.
Exactly,
100%.
like, but it would be
She'd also
so
leave with all the
fascinating.
men.
Yeah.
That's fine.
She might even just leave early if it would, depending on who else you invited. She might just show up
She'd
and then be
zero
like, you
in
know what,
on a
I'm
man
done.
who
Well,
was
like-
going to be helpful,
Yeah,
and
there you
so
go.
that's fine.
But it'd be
right?
so interesting.
Her and Tennessee are definitely they're those girls that you meet and they've just got all this energy and they're living these really cool lives and you're really drawn to them and you want to have a drink with them, but you do not want to get too emotionally invested because they will
Yeah.
screw you at the
Well,
first
I mean,
opportunity.
what you don't want
when
to
they
do is
need
bring,
to.
if you have a male companion or
Yes.
a
Never.
suitor,
Yep.
you leave him at home. You don't want
They're a
to.
lesbian's best friend.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right. Well, I get that.
Yeah. We have one final question for you.
Oh God. Okay, here it comes.
Where can our listeners find your book and you and follow you and what you do?
Oh, that's so generous. Well, I mean, the book is available in bookstores and, it's also on Amazon. So, and I do have a website, which is easy. It's, www.mynameedencollinsworth.com. And so there are any number of ways that you can kind of dive in and you can contact me. Absolutely. They're very good about forwarding. There's a last page that allows anybody to forward, to either attack or or praise, and I will always get it, and I'm pretty good about answering, even if it's a personal attack. It just doesn't happen often, but
That's good. You
when you
never
expose
know.
yourself to the public, you just have got to accept the fact that you're going to get a little bit of everything. But that is the
100%.
way, that's the easiest way of getting in touch.
Okay.
That is
and we'll also
amazing.
make sure to share like a link to your website and everything like on
Oh,
our
that's
social
very
media when we
kind.
post
Yeah.
this episode.
That's very
Also-
kind. Well, I so enjoyed speaking to you both. You're both very lively.
Oh, thank
It's like
you.
it's like a double barrel, you got both.
Can you write a review on iTunes?
Yeah,
to the effect of
Oh,
how we're like a
yeah.
double barrel.
You know what? I'm
shotgun?
completely hopeless in terms of technology. I really am. I mean, this is not an excuse. I used to, believe it or not, when my son was stationed in China as a China analyst, and I was in New York, I would phone him and ask him to help me figure out how to unjam my fax machine. So that is how pathetic I am. I'm just, we all have our strengths and
Yes.
weaknesses. So I don't think I can help you with,
That's
anything.
okay.
That's
If you're
totally
asking me to do
fine.
anything online, I'm afraid, that's not my strong suit.
That's
I
okay. We
can't
have it
write books, though.
recorded, and I'll just keep re-listening to it every time I
Yeah,
start
exactly.
feeling
Every time
like
we
a
need
worthless.
that boost.
Every time I feel like a
Okay.
worthless piece of shit, I'm just gonna remember Eden Collinsworth said we were like a double barrel. And it's just a
No,
lot of
no,
energy
I
and
think it's
lively.
wonderful.
Okay.
Both
Also-
well, keep on reading, okay?
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
definitely will.
Thank you
Okay,
so much
good.
for joining us. And if you want to leave a 5-star review, please do that wherever you listen. Like us on Facebook at Whining About Herstory, Instagram at WAHpod, and our website, www.whiningaboutherstory, where you can find all of the
Everything.
you can find everything and merch, super cute merch, get your hoodies on. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Whining About Herstory. I'm Emily.
I'm Kelly.
Thank you, and I'm Eden, and I wish you all the best of luck.
Have an empowered day, y'all. Bye.